Hello all. I mentioned maybe doing a video about Disney Plus show Miss Marvel in my MCU's Going to Hell video, so I thought I'd dive straight in. This will be a little bit off the cuff and probably more of an overview than a deep dive, as I'm going on memory really. I should probably have watched the series again, but honestly I just didn't want to. A little background. Miss Marvel is about the fourth iteration of the character, who was originally Carol Danvers, who's now Captain Marvel. So she's kind of derivative to the power of three. This version, Kamala Khan, appeared back in 2013, around the time Marvel Comics were introducing their diverse versions of existing heroes. So in fairness, she didn't really arrive at the best of times to stand out. She's often touted as being Marvel's first female Muslim superhero, but she's actually preceded by more than 10 years by the character Dust in the X-Men books. She was created by Grant Morrison and the devil himself, Ethan Van Sciver. There's some contention over whether the character is popular or not. The first trade paperback sold well, though that included Scholastic and libraries, and it was in the New York Times graphic novel bestseller list. Though it wasn't a graphic novel, it was just a collection of the first few issues. But it's also been cancelled numerous times, and the character recently died in Spider-Man's book because she didn't have her own book to die in. I'm sure there's a devoted fan base, but I don't think it's reached beyond that. As we know, the MCU is following a female superhero agenda, as stated by Kevin Feige. So Miss Marvel seems to have jumped the queue over far more popular characters. So this show already had an uphill battle to secure an audience, and the viewing figures we can glean seem to confirm the lack of interest, sadly. So getting on to the show itself, overall it was fine. It wasn't the worst thing I've seen, but it was far from the best. Basic plot is Kamala, a 16-year-old Pakistani Muslim who lives in America. She idolises Captain Marvel, gains powers from a magic bangle, and has to balance her family's expectations and religious restrictions to be a superhero. And during the show, she finds out the truth about her family and the source of the magic. And sadly, that probably sounds better than the show actually is. I'm going to start by saying that Iman Vellani, who plays Kamala Khan, is really the highlight of the show. She's bright, engaging, with charisma by the bucketful. Her mother, played by Zenobia Zroff, I'll apologise if I pronounced that incorrectly, is also really good, and there's a nice interaction and connection and relationship between those two, and that's kind of the anchor and heart of it all. Sadly, I felt like most of the other characters, especially the villains, seemed a little half-baked by comparison. The rest of Kamala's family are fine, but pretty empty. Her friend Bruno, who's a super genius, has an unrequited love, so at least that's a little meat on the bones. Her other friend Nakia feels like a cipher for the writers. She's railing against religious barriers only to overcome them almost instantly. The villains, the clandestines, who are otherworldly beings, and more commonly known as Jinn, need the bracelet to get home, but they're a nothing burger. Their motivations and attitudes change like the wind, presumably as the script requires. And the Department of Damage Control, or DODC as I will call them going forward, are just an inept evil cop analogy, and nothing they do really makes much sense. So having these two lackluster villains really impacts the stakes in the show. For me, the family drama is the part that really works, and that was what I was engaged with. Unfortunately, there's very little colour beyond that. Everybody is really nice. Even the apparent bully is nice really quickly. One of the biggest mistakes for me is that at a certain point the action switches from Jersey to Pakistan. That was a huge jolt, and all of the storylines that you were involved in are just dropped to introduce more hollow characters and to do a massive exposition dump to tell her the origin of her powers. Introduce another love interest for Kamala, as well as random unexplained time travel. Turns out her great-grandmother was one of the clandestine. She ran off with a bangle because the others were going to use it to go home, which would cause a catastrophe on Earth. So that's why it's given Kamala powers, because she's related to one of these clandestine. To be honest, this bit felt like it was more about delving into the history of partition of India and Pakistan. That's not something I'm going to explain here, but suffice to say there's a lot more to it than this show has time to explain. During this time there's a bit of family reconciliation, Kamala's mother accepts her being a superhero, and there's quite a nice bit of Terminator-style predetermination time travel as Kamala becomes part of her own family's history. The show ends with a ridiculous Home Alone-style battle with a DODC in a school when they're pursuing Kamran, the son of the leader of the clandestine, who randomly sacrificed herself in Pakistan. Kamran, who is love interest number 2, also has the same solid light powers as Kamala for reasons. And at the end of the show is a massive threat because, as the story demands, he has no control. During this final conflict, if you want to call it that, he tries to kill members of the DODC several times and is only stopped by Kamala intervening. He nearly kills the crowd who have gathered, but finally Kamala calms him down and helps him escape whilst the crowd harangue the DODC. I mean, don't get me wrong, shooting at kids, even with stun weapons, and assaulting a school isn't the most balanced of moves. But as I say, the DODC are just clown villains. And I'm not sure if they're actually supposed to be the real villains and the clandestine are almost like sympathetic. I don't know. Those two villains are not well written. So the story is pretty uneven and half-baked like the characters, probably because the writer did the first draft then walked to go and work for Netflix. The first episode is at least visually interesting. It's got good direction mixing illustration with the live action and it had kind of a Scott Pilgrim vibe. However, that pretty much disappears immediately after that first episode, only returning in the last one, and the direction just becomes a bit more pedestrian. Apparently there's a bit of a story to that, with Miss Marvel being released earlier than intended because She-Hulk was such a mess. Now, as I say, the family stuff is good, but the superhero stuff really fails for me. I'm not too bothered that they changed her powers and origin entirely. In the comics, she's got stretchy powers and she's an Inhuman. In this, she gets the powers through a bangle and she's a Djinn. Lots of people actually were quite pissed off by that, and you have to wonder, is this even the same character when you change that much about them? Add to that, she's now the first mutant in the MCU, as if there wasn't enough in the Kamala salad. But when you think about it, that's kind of ridiculous, because, you know, it's not Cyclops or Storm or Kitty Pryde or one of the other hundreds more. No, they just changed Miss Marvel. No clue why. Her idolising of Captain Marvel makes literally no sense. She would never have seen her in action, as she's only ever been on Earth twice, briefly, during Kamala's lifetime. And the reasoning they use is really quite lame. In the comics it makes sense, because Captain Marvel, Miss Marvel's been around for a while. It even explains why she's got the name. Doesn't make much sense in this. She also wouldn't have images of Carol's helmet, because no one will have seen it. Because she has a costume where she dresses like that, and it's one of those moments that takes you out because it literally makes no sense. Still, that aside, her origin is she wants to be a superhero and got powers. No tragedy or challenges really. That can work, obviously. She clearly has good intentions, and while she wants, in part, to be a superhero because she thinks it would be cool and great to be famous, when she gets them her goal changes and she wants to help people. Predominantly people from her own community. The problem is, it just feels like it's running through the greatest hits of a superhero origin, hitting all the beats without the ad-libbed guitar shredding solo. You get a brief wacky training montage, the near disastrous first mission, a few displays of power, and then suddenly when she goes to Pakistan, she's incredibly skillfully fighting a trained vigilante. Ultimately, whilst they limited their audience to start with, this show could have worked with a few tweaks and a couple of major rewrites, to be fair. In particular, to take out all the Pakistan elements. You've got a fabulous actress and an engaging family dynamic, so concentrate on Kamala herself, facing those challenges that they said this show was about. You could then flesh out the original cast instead of stuffing more hollow people in. Sadly, I wonder if in part that was sacrificed on the altar of intersectionality, which these days seems to govern how characters with certain inherent characteristics should be portrayed. The irony is that Kamala Khan was created to represent, to put it in their words, young brown girls, but the character herself identifies with and idolises a hero who looks nothing like her. I find that quite funny. And the writer wanting to inject partition into the story, or whether it's just the MCU being inept, because that seems to be the regular thing at the moment. Mass rewrites, mass reshoots, nothing planned, nothing properly in place before they start. Honestly, I feel Iman deserves better, and sadly I don't think that's going to happen from what I've seen of the Marvels so far. It seems like her comic writing career may be on the rocks as soon as it started as well, from what I hear about Miss Marvel New Mutant. But I wish her well. Anyway, I'll leave that there. Let me know what you thought of Disney Plus's Miss Marvel. Did you enjoy it in part or whole? Did you hate it completely? I'm always interested to hear your opinions, even if that opinion is that I'm talking bollocks. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. And as always, thank you very much for listening, and peace out.